incredible revelations, outrageous sums of money, and the impact on our golden child's life turned everything upside down. I still remember that day as if it were yesterday, even though it feels like a lifetime ago. I was in our study, trying to sort through some of the clutter that had piled up over months, when I stumbled upon a folder tucked away in a corner of our shared desk. At first, I thought it was just another collection of mundane work documents, but something about the way it was labeled sent a chill down my spine. With hesitant fingers, I opened it and began scrolling through what initially appeared to be innocuous emails and text messages. As I read on, my heart pounded louder and louder until I couldn't deny it any longer. Lucille, my wife of 15 years, had been having an affair, 13 months of secret rendezvous and whispered promises behind my back. I felt as if the ground had shifted beneath me. Everything I had believed about our life together, the late-night talks, the shared dreams, the quiet understanding we had built over time, crumbled into dust before my eyes. At that moment, I was hit with a tidal wave of emotions. Shock, anger, disbelief, and an overwhelming sense of loss. I had spent years dedicating my life to our marriage, believing I had found something lasting, something real. Instead, I now found myself drowning in a betrayal so deep that I questioned every memory, every laugh, and every tear we'd shared. The realization left me paralyzed. I sat there in the dim light of our study, the hum of the refrigerator in the background suddenly magnified into an unbearable reminder of the ordinary life that was now anything but ordinary. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. Every minute of that day was consumed by an internal dialogue that spiraled into a dark abyss. I found myself wondering, how could she do this to me? When did our love become so hollow that she'd seek solace in someone else's arms? I was overwhelmed by a sense of emptiness, a void that seemed to swallow up every bit of hope I had ever nurtured. In the days that followed, my world turned gray. Mornings were the hardest, waking up to a silence that was deafening. The familiar comfort of Lucille's presence replaced by an unbearable awareness of her absence. I started questioning everything about my existence. What was the point of waking up if every day was a reminder of that irrevocable betrayal? The routine that once brought me comfort now felt like a series of mechanical actions, each one a painful reminder that nothing was as it seemed. I began sifting through old memories, desperately trying to find where I'd gone wrong, or when the foundation of our relationship had started to crack. Was it the long hours at work, the missed dinners, or simply a gradual drift apart? Each recollection was tainted by suspicion and sorrow. I even wondered if I had missed the subtle signs, the small hints that should have alerted me to a growing distance between us. The betrayal wasn't just the act itself. It was the silent accumulation of secrets, the little lies that slowly poisoned our life together. Yet, amid the despair, there was a peculiar clarity that emerged. The betrayal, as shattering as it was, forced me to confront parts of myself that I had long ignored. I began to question the very nature of love and loyalty. Had I been too blind, too wrapped up in my own world to notice the cracks in our shared existence? Or was there something more sinister at play, a hidden agenda that I couldn't quite grasp? In those solitary, agonizing hours, I started to realize that this wasn't just about infidelity. It was about a betrayal of trust, of the promises we made to each other when we vowed to share our lives. I reached a point where numbness became my constant companion. The once vibrant colors of my world faded to shades of gray, and I found solace in the solitude of my own thoughts. Depression crept in like an unwelcome guest, settling deep within my bones, sapping my energy, and eroding the meaning of life I once clung to. I stopped caring about the little things, my morning coffee, the sound of the rain on the window, even the warmth of the sun. Everything felt trivial in the wake of such profound loss. But even as I wallowed in despair, a strange undercurrent of determination began to stir. I realized that if I allowed this betrayal to define me, to dictate the rest of my life, I would be surrendering my own identity. I couldn't let the pain become an endless cycle. That realization, though small and almost imperceptible at the time, planted a seed of defiance in my heart. Somewhere beneath the layers of sorrow, I knew that I had to confront not only Lucille but also the very parts of myself that had enabled me to be so vulnerable. That day marked the beginning of a journey filled with twists and turns, where nothing was as clear-cut as it seemed. It was the start of a long, winding path into the depths of my own soul, where I would be forced to face both the darkness of betrayal and the light of rediscovered self-worth. I wasn't sure where this path would lead or how I would find my way back from the abyss, but I knew one thing for certain. I couldn't go back to the way things were. I had to search for truth, not just about Lucille's secret life, but about myself. In the quiet aftermath of that devastating discovery, as I sat alone with my thoughts and the silent echoes of a love turned sour, I made a promise to myself. I vowed to seek answers, to peel back the layers of deceit, and to reclaim the pieces of my life that had been scattered by betrayal. It was a promise made in the midst of despair, but also one that held the faint glimmer of hope. A hope that perhaps, through this pain, I might rediscover who I truly was and what it meant to live authentically. That promise was the first step on a path I never imagined I'd walk. A path fraught with unexpected revelations and challenges that would forever change the course of my life. After that devastating night of discovery, I knew I had to protect what little remained of my dignity, and perhaps, in a twisted way, begin to salvage my broken self. I started to withdraw, not out of a desire for revenge, but simply because every moment with Lucille reminded me of that cruel betrayal. I became a ghost in my own home, avoiding her in the hallways, the kitchen, even the living room where we once shared laughter and dreams. Every step I took was measured, deliberate, as if distancing myself physically might also shield me from the emotional torment that threatened to engulf me. One morning, with the weight of the past months bearing down on me, I made a decision that I knew would shatter the last remnants of pretense in our marriage. I left the divorce papers, freshly printed and ink still drying, on the kitchen table. There was something almost cathartic about placing them in plain sight, right next to a pile of bills that screamed of another betrayal. The $18,000 fee for a lawyer, a sum that now seemed to epitomize the cost of broken trust. I made no effort to hide them. Instead, I left them there as silent declarations of the end of our union, as if the paper and the cold numbers could speak the truth I had been too broken to voice. The transformation in our household was immediate and palpable. Our children, now 17 and 14, had always been perceptive, but nothing could have prepared them for this sudden, unspoken collapse of the family facade. I saw it in their eyes, the furtive glances, the quiet questions that hovered in the space between their words. They didn't need to be told what was happening. The charged silence, the abandoned conversations, and the unhidden legal documents were enough for them to understand that something irrevocable had shifted in our lives. I remember catching my daughter one evening as she stared at those papers, confusion and sorrow mingling on her young face. "Dad, is it really over?" she whispered, her voice trembling with a maturity forced upon her far too soon. I wanted to reach out, to explain that sometimes life takes cruel turns that force us to abandon what we once held dear. But I couldn't. Instead, I managed only a hollow nod, aware that the truth was as fragmented as my shattered heart. Lucille, too, seemed to drift further away with every passing day. Our home, once a vibrant tapestry of shared memories and plans, was now a barren stage for silent resentments. I stopped initiating any form of communication. Conversations that once flowed easily between us were now replaced by curt nods and the occasional, brittle exchange of words that barely acknowledged the presence of another human being. Every morning, as I passed by her in the hallway, I felt as if I was walking past a stranger who had once been my closest confidant. It was a deliberate distancing, a necessary step to avoid reliving the pain with every accidental smile or unintended touch. Yet, within the heartache, a strange clarity began to emerge. In the isolation, I found space to reflect on the life I had built with Lucille, a life that, in hindsight, was a series of compromises and quiet acquiescences. I began to ask myself if perhaps I had lost my identity in the process, if I had allowed myself to be molded into someone who simply tolerated betrayal rather than demanded honesty. The divorce papers and the lawyer's bills weren't just symbols of a failed marriage. They were signposts marking the beginning of an inward journey toward rediscovering who I truly was. And then came the twist I hadn't expected. The realization that my withdrawal was not just about protecting my wounded heart, but also about reclaiming my autonomy. By distancing myself from the person who had shattered my trust, I was inadvertently creating the space needed to confront the parts of myself I had long neglected. The stark, unhidden evidence of our unraveling, the divorce papers, the lawyer's fees, became both a curse and a catalyst. They forced me to confront the uncomfortable truth that while our relationship had been built on promises, it had been equally defined by silence and avoidance. In the solitude of my own making, I began to see that the path forward wasn't simply about ending something that was broken, but about beginning something new, even if the blueprint was uncertain. I started writing down my thoughts, piecing together the fragments of my identity that I had lost along the way. Each word, each sentence was a step toward healing, a declaration that even in the midst of betrayal and dissolution, there was a chance for renewal. The more I withdrew, the more I began to understand that this distance wasn't just a gap between Lucille and me. It was a chasm within myself that needed to be bridged before I could hope to rebuild. I realized that the silence I imposed wasn't merely a shield. It was also a mirror, reflecting back the parts of me I had long tried to ignore. My fears, my insecurities, and the painful lessons of trust and vulnerability. The very act of exposing my wounds to the harsh light of day was terrifying, yet it was also liberating. Even as the kids absorbed the tension in the house, I couldn't help but wonder if this unraveling might eventually lead to a deeper understanding of who we were as individuals. Their quiet resilience, their unspoken acceptance of the inevitable change, was a stark reminder that even in the midst of chaos, life continued, and perhaps, so could we. Standing alone in the echoing silence of our once shared home, I embraced the uncertainty of the future. With each passing day, as the distance between Lucille and me grew, I began to see that maybe this painful separation was less an end and more the beginning of a transformation I never saw coming. In the exposed glare of those divorce papers and the undeniable burden of the lawyer's bill, I found a paradoxical comfort. A clear, unambiguous signal that I was finally free to rediscover the parts of myself that had been buried beneath the weight of betrayal. It happened on an ordinary Thursday afternoon, a day that, up until that point, I'd convinced myself was just another in a long line of days marked by silent sorrow and endless introspection. I'd taken a detour from my routine, seeking solace in the anonymity of a local cafe, a small escape from the crushing weight of my crumbling marriage. As I sat nursing a lukewarm coffee, trying to distract myself with the muted hum of background chatter, I heard a familiar laugh, one that stirred memories of a time when life felt less heavy. I looked up, half expecting to see a stranger, and there she was, Monica. She'd always carried an air of effortless grace, and even now, as if fate had drawn a careful outline of who I once admired from afar, she stood there by the counter, a gentle smile lighting up her eyes. Our gazes met, and in that instant, I felt a spark, a chemistry that was both unexpected and unnerving. It wasn't just a casual greeting. It was the stirring of emotions I had long buried beneath layers of heartache and disillusionment. For a moment, I was transported back to when Monica and I had shared more than just friendly banter at mutual gatherings. I remembered the nights we talked about our dreams and disappointments, how her laughter had a way of easing the tension of a troubled day, and how her presence had always brought a sliver of hope during darker times. Now, meeting her again felt like a collision of past tenderness and present turmoil. "Andrew?" she said softly, her voice laced with genuine surprise. It took a moment for me to process the sound of her name being spoken by someone so dear. "Monica?" I managed, rising from my seat with a mix of hesitation and an undeniable pull toward the warmth of our shared history. We exchanged pleasantries, our conversation beginning in the safest, most superficial way possible. Yet beneath the surface, every word carried the weight of unspoken feelings and old memories. We found a quiet corner in the cafe, away from the clamor of everyday life, and sat down to talk. I couldn't help but notice the subtle changes in her, the slight silvering of her hair, the more measured tone of her laughter, the graceful lines that hinted at both resilience and vulnerability. As we talked, it was as if the years melted away, leaving only the raw, honest connection that had once kindled something in my heart. Monica asked about how I'd been coping, and though my response was guarded, her concern was disarming. I told her, in measured tones, that I was navigating the painful aftermath of a betrayal that had upended everything I thought I knew about love and trust. I saw a flicker of understanding in her eyes, a silent acknowledgement of my struggle. In that moment, it wasn't just our shared past that connected us. It was the mutual recognition of life's unpredictable cruelties. Despite the undeniable spark between us, I found myself treading carefully. The idea of embarking on a new relationship, of diving into another emotional labyrinth before I'd even reached the end of one, was too daunting. I could feel the raw wounds from the recent betrayal still aching, the scars of broken promises too fresh to risk reopening. With a heavy sigh, I told Monica, "I'm really glad we ran into each other, but I can't let myself start something new until my divorce is finalized. It wouldn't be fair to either of us to build something on a foundation that's still crumbling." Her eyes softened, and for a long moment, silence enveloped us. A silence filled with both understanding and a hint of regret. But then Monica surprised me. "I get that," she said, her voice steady yet imbued with an emotion I hadn't anticipated. "But sometimes, when you're drowning in your own sorrow, a little bit of genuine connection can be the lifeline you didn't know you needed. I'm not asking for anything right now, Andrew. I just want to be here for you, even if it's just as a friend." Her words struck a chord deep within me. It wasn't just a platitude. It was a genuine offer of support, a lifeline extended at the moment when I felt most isolated. I was conflicted. Part of me longed to grab onto that lifeline, to allow myself the possibility of rediscovering joy in unexpected places. Yet another part, battered by months of betrayal and enveloped in the despair of a broken marriage, urged me to remain steadfast in my resolve, to finish what had begun so painfully before risking further heartache. As we talked, the conversation meandered through memories of simpler times, the kind of memories that felt both foreign and achingly familiar. Monica recounted how life had taken unexpected turns for her as well. How she, too, had once been entangled in a relationship that left her questioning everything. There was a twist in her story that I hadn't known. The realization that the person she had once trusted with her heart had deceived her in a way that forced her to rebuild her sense of self. In sharing that, our connection deepened, as if we were two wounded souls finding solace in each other's scars. There was an unexpected irony in our meeting. Here we were, two people standing at the crossroads of their past and future, both scarred by betrayal, yet quietly daring to imagine a different possibility. The chemistry between us was undeniable, yet it was tempered by a mutual understanding of our respective pain. I found myself questioning whether I had been too rigid in my resolve. Was it possible that embracing this connection could be part of my healing process? But then I remembered the weight of my current life, the unresolved grief that still clung to me like a shadow. Despite my inner conflict, I couldn't shake the sense that Monica's presence was a turning point, a subtle challenge to the numbness I'd allowed to settle in my heart. As we parted ways that afternoon, Monica reached out and squeezed my hand, a silent promise that, no matter what, I wasn't alone in this journey. Her touch was gentle but insistent, a reminder that sometimes, even in our darkest moments, a spark of hope can light the way forward. Walking back home that day, I replayed our conversation over and over in my head. The old warmth of our connection mingled with the bitter chill of my current reality, creating a tumultuous blend of emotions. I knew I had to honor my commitment to finalize the divorce before venturing into anything new. Yet I couldn't dismiss the idea that Monica might be the unexpected beacon of light I desperately needed. In the quiet solitude of my thoughts, I began to see that perhaps this encounter was not just a random twist of fate, but a subtle invitation to reconsider the possibility of healing and renewal. Monica had re-entered my life at a time when I felt most lost, and in her presence, I glimpsed a future where the pain of betrayal might eventually give way to something else. Something genuine, something healing. So, while I remain committed to resolving the final chapters of my marriage, I also find myself quietly cherishing the memory of that afternoon. It's a reminder that even when life seems irreparably broken, unexpected meetings can offer a fragile, yet powerful, glimpse of hope. For now, I'm taking each day as it comes, balancing the demands of finalizing a painful past with the possibility of a future that might, against all odds, hold the promise of something beautifully unexpected. Sitting in our once familiar dining room, a space that had borne witness to countless shared meals, laughter, and whispered secrets, I steeled myself for what I knew had to be our final conversation. The air was thick with memories and unspoken words, and I could feel the weight of every moment that had led to this one. I looked across the table at Lucille, her eyes red-rimmed and distant, and with a voice that wavered only slightly from the steadiness I desperately clung to, I said, "Lucille, I know about your cheating. I know everything, and I want a divorce." I had expected a resigned silence, a nod perhaps, something that would confirm the inevitable end of our marriage. Instead, the reaction that unfolded before me was something I hadn't anticipated at all. Lucille's face crumpled instantly. The mask of indifference shattered as tears welled up, blurring her vision. In a torrent of sobs, she began to beg, her voice breaking with a mixture of despair and pleading. "Andrew, please, I can't lose you. I made a terrible mistake, but we can fix this. I love you. We can work it out." Her words, drenched in anguish, sent a cold shiver down my spine. I listened unmoving as she continued, desperation turning her plea into something more transactional. I found a really great therapist. We can start family therapy together, and it's only $7,000 per session. We can heal, rebuild, everything. For a long, heavy moment, I sat in stunned silence. The absurdity of it all hit me like a punch to the gut. Was this truly a cry for help, or a last-ditch attempt at bargaining, trying to place a price tag on forgiveness and trust? The mention of that specific amount made everything feel even more surreal, as if she were trying to negotiate her way out of the betrayal rather than own up to it. I could almost see the weight of her guilt materialize in the form of those exact dollars, as if each note could stitch up the gaping wound left by her infidelity. My mind raced. Part of me, the part that still clung to memories of happier times, wavered in a moment of uncertainty. Could it be possible that beneath the layers of lies and betrayal there still existed a fragment of the woman I once loved? For a fleeting second, I considered the possibility that maybe, just maybe, there was a path to redemption that didn't have a price tag. But then I remembered the 13 months of betrayal, the quiet accumulation of deceit that had corroded our relationship from within, and the irreversible damage done not only to me but to our entire family. "Lucille," I said softly, my voice steadying as the resolve within me hardened. "No amount of money or therapy can erase what's happened. You can't put a price on trust, on the years we've lost, on the pain I feel every day." I paused, searching her tear-streaked face for any sign that she truly understood the finality of my words. "I'm sorry, but I can't do this. I can't let you try to buy back what we had. I want a divorce." The room fell into a silence so profound that even the ticking of the clock seemed intrusive. Lucille's sobs subsided into soft, heart-wrenching hiccups as she stared at me with a mix of raw sorrow and a dawning realization that her desperate attempt to salvage our marriage was failing. In that moment, I saw not only the woman who had once been my confidant and partner, but also someone utterly lost. Someone who had attempted to barter for forgiveness in a currency that could never measure up to the depth of our broken trust. As the finality of my decision settled between us like an unyielding barrier, I couldn't help but feel that this was more than just a divorce. It was the irrevocable end of a chapter filled with love, betrayal, and a series of choices that had led us to this precipice. The proposal of $7,000 therapy sessions wasn't just an offer. It was a symbol of everything that had gone wrong. It was a desperate plea wrapped in the guise of a solution, a final twist in a narrative that had already spiraled far beyond redemption. I rose from the table that day with the crushing certainty that some wounds run too deep to be healed by good intentions or expensive therapy. As I walked away, I knew that every step I took was a step away from a past that had become irreparably tainted. a past that I could no longer allow to define who I was or who I would become. The door to our shared life closed with a finality that echoed in the silence of our once-beloved home, leaving behind only the stark truth. Some betrayals are too profound to be mended, and some goodbyes are as inevitable as the rising sun. In the wake of that final, soul-crushing conversation with Lucille, I felt compelled to dig even deeper into the ruins of my shattered life. The questions that haunted me weren't confined to our broken marriage. They seeped into every crevice of my existence, gnawing at the very foundation of my identity. One of the most painful uncertainties was the paternity of our children. Even after years together, doubts had crept in like insidious shadows. Could it be that the betrayal had extended its venom into the lives of my 17-year-old son and 14-year-old daughter? In a moment of grim resolve, I decided that I had to know the truth once and for all. I swallowed my pride and wrote a check for $3,500 to cover a DNA paternity test. The process was clinical and detached. A series of sterile appointments, swab collections, and endless waiting. As I sat in the cold, fluorescent-lit waiting room of the lab, I couldn't help but feel that I was bearing not only my children's secrets, but my own vulnerabilities too. Every passing day, every minute of that anxious wait, was a relentless reminder of the years we had lost to deception. I wasn't just testing bloodlines. I was testing the very limits of my shattered trust and wounded heart. But as I wrestled with the implications of the DNA test, another, more dangerous idea began to take root in my mind. In the midst of my private torment, I uncovered hints, careless slips, indirect evidence, and a few cryptic online posts that suggested Lucille's affair wasn't as simple as I had once believed. There was a name, a face, and, shockingly, a marital status attached to the man who had so recklessly invaded our life. The deeper I dug, the clearer it became that Lucille's lover was not a solitary, wandering spirit but a married man. One who had his own unsuspecting partner living in blissful ignorance of his betrayal. The thought of it lit a spark of vengeful justice inside me. I found myself oscillating between disgust and a morbid curiosity. What if I could expose him, not just for my own shattered pride, but for the sake of his wife, who, like me, deserved to know the truth? I began to toy with the idea of tracking him down, of gathering every scrap of evidence I could, and then, one day, calling his wife to tell her exactly what had been happening behind closed doors. In my darkest moments, I even pictured the shock and devastation on her face, a mirror of my own pain, as the full weight of the betrayal crashed down upon her. Yet, the more I contemplated this possibility, the more I felt the heavy burden of the moral line I was approaching. Was I truly any better than Lucille for considering unleashing such chaos? The thought kept me up at night, a relentless internal debate between a desire for righteous retribution and the stark realization that exposing someone else's secret could unleash collateral damage far beyond my own crumbling world. I began scribbling my conflicted thoughts into a battered journal, hoping that the act of writing might somehow ease the internal strife. Every word felt like a confession, every line a step closer to a truth I wasn't sure I could handle. There were nights when I stared at the dark ceiling, imagining the call I might one day make. "Hello? Is this?" I'd start, only to falter as I pictured her. A gentle, unsuspecting soul who might shatter under the burden of truth. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was caught in a web of betrayal, using the very instruments of deception to expose further layers of it. I wrestled with the idea that by exposing him, I might be compounding the tragedy, not alleviating my own suffering. The pain of betrayal was already immeasurable. Adding another layer felt like pouring salt into the wound, not healing it. The waiting for the DNA test results was a torment of its own. I recall sitting in my study late one night, the soft hum of the city outside providing a stark contrast to the tumult inside me. Every creak of the floor, every rustle of paper, seemed magnified by the tension of uncertainty. In those moments, I wasn't just a betrayed husband or a heartbroken father. I was an investigator of my own life, desperate to reclaim some semblance of control. And then, amidst this sea of turmoil, a twist I hadn't anticipated began to take shape. I received a cryptic email from an unknown sender. The subject line read, The truth will out. At first, I dismissed it as another digital echo of my own spiraling thoughts, but as I read further, I realized that someone else had been watching, someone who knew more about the affair than I did. The email hinted at details I hadn't yet uncovered, snippets of conversations, hidden rendezvous, and even a vague timeline that didn't quite match the narrative I had pieced together on my own. Was it possible that there was an even larger network of lies, a broader conspiracy behind the affair? The possibility both terrified and intrigued me. In that moment, I faced an unsettling realization. The betrayal that had upended my life might have been only the tip of a far more complex iceberg. I found myself questioning everything. Had Lucille been a pawn in a game far larger than our relationship? Was her infidelity merely a symptom of deeper, systemic deceit? The email left me with more questions than answers, and the weight of those questions settled heavily on my shoulders. The notion of exposing the cheating to the other man's wife, once a tantalizing prospect of poetic justice, now seemed fraught with even greater peril. If there was indeed a web of secrets entangling not just two, but 3 or more lives, then pulling at one thread might unravel a cascade of unforeseen consequences. My internal debate intensified. On one hand, I longed to shatter the veneer of respectability that had allowed this betrayal to flourish. On the other, I feared that doing so would irrevocably destroy more lives than just my own. I wrestled with these thoughts over many sleepless nights, pacing the darkened rooms of our once shared home, now echoing with memories of happier times. In the dim glow of my desk lamp, I jotted down potential plans and counterplans, weighing the cost of justice against the risk of further heartache. The DNA test, a sterile procedure conducted in the name of truth, was now just one piece of a much larger puzzle. A puzzle that threatened to redefine everything I thought I knew about loyalty, trust, and the nature of betrayal. When the long-awaited test results finally arrived, I felt a momentary flicker of hope, only to be quickly smothered by a tidal wave of uncertainty. The results confirmed what I had long suspected. The children were, indeed, mine. Despite everything, the bloodline remained unbroken by the affair. Yet, that revelation did little to ease the sting of betrayal. If anything, it deepened the irony. Even as I clung to the fact that our children were mine, I was forced to confront the reality that the love we had once shared had been irreparably tainted by deception. The man who had entangled himself in Lucille's life was still out there, his actions casting a long, dark shadow over what remained of my family's legacy. Now, armed with the clarity of the DNA test and the unsettling hints from the anonymous email, I stood at a crossroads. The idea of informing the other man's wife still simmered at the back of my mind. A dangerous lure promising retribution but threatening to unleash a storm of collateral damage. Every rational part of me screamed caution, urging restraint for the sake of all involved. Yet, the raw, unyielding anger that had defined the past months tempted me with its seductive promise of closure, of finally forcing the truth into the light. In that tense, reflective space, I realized that I was no longer just a victim of betrayal. I was an unwilling arbiter of justice, caught in a moral quandary with no clear right or wrong answers. The decision before me was monumental: to expose the web of deceit that had ensnared so many, or to retreat into the painful, solitary confines of my own grief. I knew that whichever path I chose would have irreversible consequences, not just for me, but for everyone entangled in this tragedy. So here I am, teetering on the brink of a decision that could forever alter the course of our lives. The DNA test, the anonymous email, the very notion of retribution. They all swirl together into a maelstrom of conflicting emotions. As I sit here, pouring my heart out onto these pages, I can't help but wonder. In the pursuit of truth and justice, how far is too far? And in the end, will exposing the full extent of the betrayal bring me the closure I so desperately seek? Or will it only open old wounds that may never heal? For now, the call remains unmade, the email unanswered. I'm left with nothing but the quiet hum of regret and the relentless pulse of uncertainty. A reminder that in a world built on betrayal, every truth uncovered is often a prelude to even deeper, more tangled mysteries. 2 weeks after that final, shattering conversation with Lucille, fate brought us together again. an encounter I had both dreaded and, in some twisted way, anticipated. I was walking through the park near our old home, the crisp autumn air a harsh contrast to the heavy silence that had settled over my life. And there she was, emerging from behind a copse of trees, her figure unmistakable yet transformed. Lucille had changed. The woman I once knew, confident, composed, had been reduced to a shadow of herself. Her face, once radiant with a familiar warmth, now looked gaunt and drawn, her eyes tired and haunted by secrets too heavy to bear. I could immediately tell she had lost a lot of weight. It was as if the burden of her choices had physically stripped her of vitality. For a long, suspended moment, neither of us spoke, as if the space between us had filled with all the unsaid words, regrets, and lost promises of our shared past. Finally, she broke the silence in a voice that trembled with exhaustion and remorse. "Andrew, I need to tell you something," she began hesitantly, her eyes downcast as if afraid that meeting my gaze might shatter her further. I broke up with him 4 months ago. For months, the words struck me harder than I expected. I'd assumed that the affair was still an active, festering wound, its poison continuously seeping into every aspect of our life. Instead, here was Lucille, confessing that her entanglement had ended long before I'd confronted her with the truth. For a fleeting moment, a surge of conflicting emotions roiled within me. Anger, disbelief, and an unexpected, bitter irony. Had she been free for months? And yet, somehow, the betrayal still clung to every memory like a stain? I searched her face, looking for any hint that this revelation might somehow redeem her, that the remorse in her voice could undo the damage of 13 months of infidelity. Instead, I saw only raw exhaustion and regret, a woman who had paid dearly for her choices. Despite that, my heart remained as hardened as it had been since that fateful day of discovery. The revelation of a breakup, as painful as it might have been for her to admit, didn't soften the betrayal for me. It was a twist I hadn't expected, but one that only deepened the wound. "Lucille," I said, my voice steady but laced with an edge of finality. "I appreciate you telling me, but it doesn't change anything." I paused, watching as her eyes filled with fresh tears, each one a silent plea for forgiveness that I knew I could no longer offer. "I don't love you anymore. The trust we once had is gone, and no amount of time or regret can mend that. A divorce is inevitable." Her lips quivered as if she wanted to say more, to beg for another chance, but the words died in the pit of her throat. In that moment, I realized the cruel paradox of our situation. Here she was, having already ended the affair and, perhaps, starting to confront the consequences of her actions on her own. Losing weight, appearing utterly exhausted, as if fighting a battle that had drained every ounce of her spirit. Yet, despite her apparent attempts at redemption, I was irrevocably changed. The wound was too deep, the scars too prominent. The betrayal wasn't erased by her breakup. It was cemented into my very being, a permanent reminder of the life we once promised each other. I remember thinking that sometimes, the truth is less about the timing of an apology or the end of a deceit, and more about the irreversible damage left in its wake. Even if she had broken free of the affair months ago, the betrayal had already set our course toward an inevitable end. I could no longer see a future in which the two of us could rebuild what was lost. As we stood there under the fading light of the autumn afternoon, the silence between us spoke volumes. It was a silence filled with memories of laughter, shared dreams, and a love that had gradually withered under the weight of dishonesty. I realized that I wasn't just saying goodbye to Lucille the person. I was saying farewell to the life we had built together, to the trust that had once defined our union. With a heavy heart, I turned away, the finality of my decision echoing in every step I took. The promise of a future with her, even one marked by atonement and healing, was beyond reach. I knew that moving forward meant accepting the pain and forging a new identity out of the ruins of betrayal. As the distance between us grew with each step, I resolved that the divorce wasn't just a legal formality. It was the only path left to reclaiming my own truth, to finally leaving behind a past that had drained me of all hope. In that moment, I realized that sometimes the hardest choices aren't about saving what's left, but about letting go entirely. And though the memory of Lucille would forever be etched in my heart, the time had come to close that chapter and begin anew. It wasn't long after the final, irrevocable goodbye that life began to reveal its unexpected twists, and in a way, its bittersweet rewards. I remember the day I first heard the news. Lucille had, of her own volition, decided to confess everything to everyone. Apparently, the burden of secrets had finally become too heavy for her to bear. In a public admission that left no room for denial, she spilled every sordid detail about her 13-month-long betrayal. I listened to the ripple effects from afar, a cocktail of regret, anger, and a strange sense of inevitability mingling together. It was as if she'd thought that by confessing, she could somehow reclaim her lost innocence. Instead, it only confirmed that the path we were on had been irreversibly severed. And if that wasn't enough, fate decided to serve one more twist. The man who had once shared her bed was not just an anonymous figure in our turbulent saga. His own wife, an unsuspecting, gentle soul who had once trusted him completely, discovered the truth. In a moment of raw, cathartic justice, she confronted him and, with a mix of heartbreak and steely resolve, kicked him out of their home. Watching the dominoes fall, I couldn't help but feel that the universe was balancing the scales, even if the price was paid in shattered lives and irreversible pain. Despite the grim poetry of it all, I found myself grappling with an unexpected undercurrent of relief. Yes, there was a lingering guilt, a reminder of the family we once were and the life we had built. But deep down, I knew that I had made the right choice. Continuing in a marriage tarnished by betrayal, even for the sake of appearances, would have been a slow, daily erosion of my very soul. I decided then that the only way forward was to reclaim myself completely. I turned to sports as a form of therapy. What began as a tentative jog around the neighborhood soon evolved into an invigorating routine. Every sprint, every game, chipped away at the numbness that had engulfed me for so long. I discovered that the rhythm of physical exertion could synchronize with the steady beat of a healing heart, one that was slowly learning to trust life again. Emboldened by this newfound energy, I took a decisive step toward a new beginning, a tangible one. I invested $25,000 into a new house, a place that was to become my sanctuary. The old home, steeped in memories of betrayal and regret, had become too heavy a reminder of a past best left behind. My new place was modest yet welcoming, with bright rooms that promised hope and quiet corners that invited reflection. Each day, as I settled deeper into this fresh space, I felt as if I were laying down the foundations of a life unburdened by the ghosts of yesterday. Slowly but surely, the contours of a normal life began to reemerge. I reconnected with friends and rediscovered interests that had lain dormant for years. I even picked up long-lost hobbies, reading at a cozy corner in the new house, exploring nature on weekend hikes, and, yes, playing sports with a vigor I hadn't known in years. With every step forward, the ache of betrayal dulled, replaced by the steady, resolute pulse of healing and renewal. In the quiet moments, when guilt still crept in like a shadow in the corners of my mind, I reminded myself that moving on didn't mean forgetting the past. It meant learning from it. I hung a simple painting in the living room, a sunrise over an endless horizon, its warm hues a daily testament to the promise of new beginnings. That image, bathed in the soft light of early morning, became my silent vow to myself that the pain I had endured was not the end of my story, but the prelude to something better. Yes, the journey was far from over, and the scars of betrayal might never fully fade. Yet, in the mirror of my new life, I saw a man reclaiming his identity, a man who refused to let past wounds dictate his future. Lucille's confession and the ensuing chaos in her own world were no longer my burden to bear. I had chosen to step away from that toxic chapter, embracing a life that was defined not by the betrayals of others, but by my own strength and resilience. In time, the guilt transformed into gratitude, for the lessons learned, for the strength uncovered, and for the clear, unambiguous truth that sometimes the hardest choices are the ones that lead us back to ourselves. And as I laced up my sneakers for yet another run on a crisp morning, I couldn't help but smile at the thought that I was finally free to rebuild, to love again, and most importantly, free to be me.